Snow fell in thick white curtains across the frozen plains of Nebraska Territory, 1872. Beneath that vast, lonely sky, a man named Joseph Krall, a Czech immigrant, trudged through knee-deep snow toward the small log cabin he had built with his own hands. The wind sliced his face raw, and the woodpile outside was shrinking fast. Every settler said the same thing: "Winter'll eat you alive out here, foreigner." But Joseph only smiled and whispered, "We survived worse in Bohemia." Joseph had come with nothing but his late wife's locket and a dream to start over. His 3-room cabin was modest, just rough-hewn logs and clay chinking, but it was home. What he couldn't stand was the bitter cold that seeped through every crack. Each night, frost formed on the inside walls, and the fire in his small iron stove barely kept the room from freezing. He spent more time feeding it than sleeping. At the town's supply store, settlers mocked his accent and strange ideas. "You need a bigger stove, Checky," one man laughed. "Ain't no way a twig burner like yours'll heat that cabin." Joseph said nothing. He'd been thinking of something different. Something he remembered from his grandfather's tales, a corner tower stove built of clay and brick that could hold heat for days. The locals laughed louder when he mentioned it. A fireplace in the corner. "You're gonna cook yourself out of that shack." When spring came, Joseph began collecting materials: clay from the creek bed, flat stones from the hills, bits of scrap iron from the blacksmith's refuse pile. Neighbors watched him stack bricks into a tall, narrow tower that reached toward the rafters. He mixed clay and straw by hand, plastering the gaps with a mason's care. Children gathered to giggle, calling it Joseph's crazy chimney. Their fathers just shook their heads. They said the foreigner was wasting his time. By midsummer, the tower stove stood complete, rough and uneven, but proud. Joseph installed a small firebox near the bottom, built a winding flue through the inside, and capped it with smooth stones that would trap heat. "It breathes like a man," he told himself, remembering his father's words. When he lit the first fire that night, the stove glowed like a sleeping beast. He could feel warmth spreading through the room, not from the flame, but from the stone itself. The townsfolk came to see his invention the next morning. "How's your tower doing, Joseph?" "Keeping the angels warm," one man teased. Joseph invited them in. They touched the walls, still warm to the hand though the fire had burned out hours ago. "Trick of the air," one said dismissively, and they all laughed again. Joseph just smiled quietly, tending to his stove like an old friend. As autumn approached, rumors spread that the coming winter would be the harshest in decades. The settlers prepared by felling extra wood, patching cracks, and stuffing straw between the logs of their homes. Joseph simply polished his clay stove and gathered a modest pile of birch logs. "That's all you got," one neighbor scoffed. "You'll be a frozen statue by New Year." Joseph shrugged. "Maybe, but I trust my stove more than gossip." By December, the plains froze solid. Blizzards buried fences and iced over rivers. Inside most cabins, fires raged constantly, smoke curling from every chimney. Yet Joseph's cabin stood quiet, its chimney puffing only a few times a day. Inside, his rooms were warm, 55 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than outside, the walls gently radiating heat from the tower in the corner. He slept without shivering for the first time in years. Word traveled fast. One night, a knock came at his door. It was Samuel, the same man who'd mocked him at the store. "Joseph, my kids, they're freezing. Can we stay a night?" Joseph opened the door wide, letting in the family. They stepped inside, astonished. "It's like spring in here," Samuel whispered, his eyes wide. The tower hummed softly with life, the stones still warm from the fire lit that morning. For days they stayed, and Joseph never once mentioned the teasing or the laughter. He shared bread, soup, and warmth as if the past had never existed. Samuel's little daughter pressed her hands to the stove and smiled. "It feels like it's breathing," she said. Joseph chuckled softly. "Yes, little one, it breathes warmth into the heart." When the storm finally broke, Samuel went back to town and told everyone what he'd seen. The settlers didn't believe him at first, until more families came seeking warmth. Soon, Joseph's cabin became a beacon in the white wilderness, its windows glowing with steady light when others went dark. But not everyone was happy. One man, Edgar Boone, the wealthiest settler in town, grew jealous. He'd invested in iron stoves he sold to the community, and Joseph's success threatened that. That foreigner's trick won't last, he sneered. He's using some secret fuel, mark my words. And when jealousy burns, it burns colder than any winter wind. One night, as Joseph slept, a flicker of orange light woke him. His woodpile outside was ablaze. He rushed into the storm, shouting for help, but no one came. By morning, the fire had died, and his wood, his lifeline, was gone. He stood in the snow, heartbroken. For the first time in months, fear crept in again. Without wood, his miracle stove would soon grow cold. Joseph sat before the dying embers that night, his hands trembling. He whispered to the photograph of his wife on the shelf, "I thought I had beaten the cold, Anna, but maybe not men's hearts." Yet as he stared into the coals, an idea sparked in him, one that could change everything. He rose, determined. "If they take my fire," he said, "then I will build something that no man can take." For 3 long days, Joseph worked without rest. He broke apart old furniture, split fence rails, and gathered what little wood he could find. His hands bled, but his spirit refused to break. He rebuilt the burned pile into something new, a dome of clay and stone around the base of his stove, designed to hold the fire's heat even longer. When he lit it again, the stove pulsed with a deep, living warmth that spread through every room, stronger than before. It was as if his wife's spirit had guided his hands. The storm outside raged for weeks, freezing wells, killing livestock, and trapping settlers in their homes. One by one, families ventured toward Joseph's cabin through blinding snow. They came with frostbitten fingers and shivering children, drawn by the rumors of a house that never turned cold. Joseph welcomed them all, feeding them what little he had left. "If the Lord gave me fire," he said softly, "it's not mine to keep." By midwinter, nearly a dozen people were living inside his 3-room cabin. The tower stove glowed like a heart in the corner, radiating steady heat through every wall. The settlers watched in awe as it burned low yet stayed warm through the night. "How does it work?" one man asked. Joseph smiled. "Heat should live in stone, not smoke. The fire teaches us that warmth can stay if we build the right home for it." Even Edgar Boone, the jealous trader, couldn't ignore the stories any longer. His store was nearly empty, his stoves unsold, and his pride bruised. One evening, desperate, he trudged through the snow to Joseph's door. When Joseph opened it, Edgar's face was pale, lips blue, his hands trembling. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Joseph stepped aside. "Come in," he said simply. "The fire doesn't ask who mocked it." Edgar sat near the tower, thawing in silence. He watched the clay surface glow faintly, heat breathing from its core. "I burned your woodpile," he confessed at last, shame in his eyes. "I couldn't stand watching you succeed." Joseph looked at him, then at the fire. "And did the cold grow kinder to you for it?" Edgar lowered his head. Joseph sighed gently. "Let it warm you anyway. A cold heart doesn't melt in the dark, only near light." The following days transformed the town. Word spread beyond the valley, and travelers arrived to see the strange Czech stove that defied the blizzards. Joseph taught anyone who asked how to build one, no charge, no secrets. "The warmth," he said, "is meant to be shared." His tiny home became a workshop of hope, echoing with laughter instead of mockery. Children helped mix clay. Women painted the stoves with flowers. Men carried bricks and learned to shape flues that curved like river paths. Each new stove that rose in the settlement became a symbol, not just of warmth, but of humility and wisdom from a man they once called a fool. Joseph would smile and tell them, "It's not Czech magic. It's patience, and faith that what you build with love will hold heat longer." By the next winter, every home in the valley had its own version of the tower stove. No smoke hung thick in the air, no chimneys poured waste into the sky. The settlers used less wood but lived warmer than ever before. Children played barefoot near the corners of their cabins while snow drifted outside. When travelers asked how, they answered proudly, "Ask Joseph Kroll, the man who taught us to build fire that lasts." Joseph watched from his porch as neighbors passed, tipping their hats with respect. He no longer felt like a stranger among them. For years, he had carried the loneliness of a man who'd buried his wife and his homeland. Now, in every tower stove burning across the valley, he felt her presence, her warmth reflected back to him 100-fold. "You were right, Anna," he whispered. "Home isn't where you live. It's where your fire reaches." When spring returned, the valley bloomed brighter than ever. The people planted gardens where snow once claimed crops. At the heart of town, the settlers built a small monument, a brick pillar shaped like Joseph's first tower stove. At its base, they carved the words, "He warmed our homes, and our hearts." Joseph stood before it, speechless, tears shining in his eyes. Years later, Joseph's health began to fade, but his cabin never grew cold. Even in his final winter, the stove burned low and steady, a constant heartbeat against the chill. Townsfolk often visited to check on him, bringing bread or kindling, but Joseph would only smile. "Keep your wood," he'd say. "The stove and I have learned to share what little we have." On the night he passed, the snow fell quietly. Inside his cabin, the fire glowed softly, casting warm light across his peaceful face. The townsfolk found him in his chair by the tower, his hand resting on the stone, a faint smile frozen in eternal calm. When they touched the stove, they felt its warmth, still alive, as if refusing to let him go cold. The next morning, the townspeople gathered. They lit every tower stove in the valley at once. From every home, thin trails of smoke rose gently into the sky, twisting together like prayers. They said that for 3 days, the valley stayed warm, even without adding wood. Some claimed Joseph's spirit lingered in the stone, whispering to the fire to keep his people safe. Generations later, the legend of Joseph Kroll lived on. His descendants, and the settlers' children after them, still built tower stoves in his name. And every winter, when the first snow fell, the townsfolk would touch the corner of their hearts and say, "To the Czech man who taught us warmth is not burned, it's built." The laughter that once mocked him had turned into songs of gratitude, echoing through the valley he made forever warm.